You know what most people want from WrestleMania? They want it to mean something. Pitched as the biggest and most important event of the year, that means nothing if it doesn't deliver both during the build up to the event and on the night itself. Doesn't even matter if the story is dumb. If I'm challenging Kevin Owens knowing if I win I get my hair back, but you believe I want this more than life itself and you're invested, you'll come along for the journey. There just has to be effort from all sides. The fact that it is the show of shows is not enough. Given that we're on the cusp of WrestleMania 35 though, meaning 34 other iterations have come beforehand, then yes, that's maths. It's simply not possible WWE would have a perfect record. There's been too many wrestlers featured and on occasion way too many cooks in the kitchen. Given that also extends to the World Heavyweight Championship and its many guises, well, that's not so hot. You always want the big belt to be held in as much esteem as possible, but as we know, that's not always the case. I'm Simon from WhatCulture, and this is the 10 worst WWE WrestleMania World Title storylines. Number 10, Taker vs. Sid. Happening at WrestleMania 13, the biggest problem with the story between champion Psycho Sid and The Undertaker was that there was no story. This is mostly due to the fact that the entire plan for the show was changed. Originally meant to see Bret Hart reclaim his gold from Shawn Michaels, that hit two snags when 1. Vince McMahon took the title away from their clash after deciding it was too obvious, and 2. The match imploding altogether after what happened with HBK's knee injury. As you'll remember, he wasn't on the card at all, whereas the Hitman went on to have a Stone Cold Classic against Steve Austin. And yes, that is the worst pun of all time. This shifted the championship into everything that was happening between Sid and Taker, but that just resulted in stare downs and expected brawls, which didn't do much for the emotion of the match. It just felt like this is what had to happen because there was nothing else. Even the Phenom's win didn't do much. It was cool to see him close the show as the champ, but were we talking about it when all was said and done? Not really. It was average at best. Number 9, Edge vs. Jericho. Even without a story, knowing that Chris Jericho and Edge are going to clash at WrestleMania 26 should be enough to get your juices going. Two of the very best, especially back then, WWE could have even gone with a who is the better man narrative, and the simple nature of that would have worked. Instead, it was just a bit meh. The initial problem came in the fact Edge was the face, and it just wasn't the same as his incredible heel run. As a good guy, the rated R superstar had to ditch his crazy eyes and straight up sadism, and it was sorely missed. The whole program too was focused on how desperate Edge was to spear Jericho, an angle that was overdone before we got to match time. The highlight came when Y2J questioned Edge's DNA given how many injuries he'd had throughout his career, and that should have been the centerpiece really. Playing off reality worked fans into the program, but it petered out soon after. The result was a fight at Mania, which was kinda just there, although it didn't help that they followed the clash between Bret Hart and Vince McMahon, which is as baffling today as it was almost a decade ago. Furthermore, Edge failed in his attempt to win the World Heavyweight Championship. Alright, let's move on. Number 8, Rey Mysterio vs. Randy Orton vs. Kurt Angle. It's a good thing we're focusing on story here because in terms of a match, you won't find many better given this lasted less than 10 minutes. Rey, Randy and Kurt proved to everyone why they were at the level they were as they just went all out for the short time they had before coronating Mysterio as the champ. He pinned Randy Orton and it's just a lot of fun. The problems came in everything that happened prior to WrestleMania 22. Aside from the fact Mysterio had actually lost the match to the Viper at No Way Out, which was meant to cost him his main event, Rey just got back in regardless. This was a period where WWE had decided to focus on the death of Eddie Guerrero in a way not everybody was comfortable with. Orton saying he was in hell, for example, was the opposite of good taste. It was the foundations for everything Mysterio did during this time, and it certainly did put a damper on things. Rey had earned his opportunity as the champ through years of hard work and unreal in-ring performances, but here it seemed as if his moment in the sun was just because his friend had died. Guerrero's passing was hard to take anyway, but having it showcased like this was not entertaining or the way anyone wanted to see the luchador win the big one. It was nice that he did, but I think we could have done a bit better. Number 7, Edge vs. The Big Show vs. John Cena. The issue here was that WWE didn't know what else to do. Edge vs. Cena vs. Big Show was actually rather fun at Mania 25, but when it came to their characters, there wasn't much they could do as a group. Cena was the Cena we'd all started to boo, Edge had been the opportunist for 5 years, which to be fair does make that earlier face turn we talked about more sensical, and the Big Show was the Big Show. He just did his Big Show thing and either liked it or you didn't. Not much was going to change from this point on. It meant that leading up to the night, it was all about Edge's relationship with SmackDown GM Vicky Guerrero and how that would influence the showcase of the Immortals. It hit Cena hard at first as she banned him from the match, but that changed when it transpired he had dirt on Vicky. Despite her so-called love for Edge, she was also off canoodling with the Big Show as well. Oh dear. This may have had some impact if it hadn't been played for laughs, but the thought of Guerrero and Show being an item was treated as an absolute joke, which bled into the fight itself. It also painted CENA as a blackmailer, which was interesting. He manipulated his way into the main event and even won the belt to boot. And they say crime doesn't pay. Number 6, Triple H vs Randy Orton. WrestleMania 25's plans were correct. Deciding that Randy Orton should be an absolute psychopath, he terrorized Triple H and the McMahon family, including a very uncomfortable angle with Stephanie as the game looked on. If you were trying to paint the Viper as someone who doesn't care, this was the way to do it. Or at least it was, until on one episode of Raw, Triple H chased Orton around for about 30 minutes as Randy looked terrified. That didn't help with the aura that had been built up, and this continued when Tripp smashed his way into the third generation superstar's house and made him look like a fool. Orton had gone from predator to prey in what seemed like seconds. The real letdown was the match at Mania itself. Despite the pair acting like they wanted to kill each other beforehand, when they got in the ring, they just wrestled. There was no anger, no heat, no intensity. They started to apply headlocks and it made no sense. If someone broke into where I lived, I wouldn't apply some pressure to their neck. I'd try and rip their head off. It was a shame, as with the right conclusion, we could have been saying very different things about this. But as you can see, we're not. Number 5, Roman Reigns vs Brock Lesnar. Referring to their first WrestleMania clash, which went down at 31, the joy with this is that when all was said and done, it was great. The match surpassed all expectations, and the Seth Rollins cash-in to close the show was one of the best main events WWE had executed in years. It's still good now too, in case you'd never enjoyed it. Ticks your boxes. Leading up to this, though, was just a barrel of difficulties. Fans had well and truly got on their "we're going to boo Roman" bandwagon, meaning WWE's only plan was to try and counteract that. But they had Daniel Bryan endorse him, they had The Rock endorse him, and Paul Heyman went on the record stating that Reigns could beat any champion in any era, apart from Lesnar. Everything was drafted towards trying to shift the public perception, and yet nothing worked. It was an obstacle that just couldn't be overcome. Outside of that, not much was going on anyway. Brock wasn't on many shows for reasons we know all too well, so the big dog had to make do attacking the Authority, which didn't build up the match itself. When Raw finally had the Beast on TV, all the writers could come up with was a segment where Lesnar and Reigns tried to pull the belt away from one another. It's like the worst game of tug-of-war you've ever seen. It meant we all went in thinking this was going to be a bust, but again, it really wasn't. Hard-hitting, brutal, and with a shock finish, in many ways it stole the show, if you don't count that RKO Orton hit on Rollins. Number 4, Triple H vs Booker T. One that we all talk about when these ideas spring into life. Booker T vs Triple H at WrestleMania 19 was just bad. Say what you want about WWE's political correctness today, but it's far better than whatever this was. Still makes people pull uncomfortable faces. But yes, in building up their World Heavyweight title clash, the game talked about Booker's criminal past, used phrases such as "people like you don't win championships," and even asked him to dance. I really do think you can only look at this one way. If the 5-time WCW champion had won this one, it could have been salvaged a tad. The man who was so very wronged, proving that everything Triple H said was bullcrap, but that didn't happen. Trips won cleanly after hitting Booker T with a pedigree, and then taking around 56 years to make the pin. It wasn't too dissimilar to Harley Race making uneasy remarks to Ron Simmons before his 1992 match against Vader, but at least there, Simmons shut him up by whooping his ass and taking the title. The fact that 21 years later we went the other way, well, you tell me, because I don't know. Number 3, Alberto Del Rio vs Jack Swagger. 10 years on at WrestleMania 29, we were back to the controversial, as Alberto Del Rio and Jack Swagger fought for gold while WWE made sure we knew what was actually at the heart of the matter. Del Rio was now a face and pitched as a fun-loving Latino hero, whereas Jack Swagger with Zeb Coulter was shouting, "We the people!" and insinuating that borders to Mexico should be closed. Okay then. Glad we're back here. The storyline tried to tie into current news talking points, but didn't really do so with any of the lighter touches you'd need. It was more like a knockout blow to the side of the head you all had to deal with. What didn't help was that Alberto wasn't really connecting as a good guy, and Swagger had his own issues. For one, he'd been treated so badly since his original world title win he'd lost all credibility. Fans just weren't buying into the feud. There was also a cringy spot where Del Rio and his personal ring announcer Ricardo Rodriguez attempted to impersonate Swagger and Coulter, and it just wasn't enough to make this film Mania worthy. Alberto would beat Jack in what would be the final time the World Heavyweight Championship was defended at the Show of Shows, Facts. Number 2, Hulk Hogan vs Sergeant Slaughter. In the summer of 1990, tensions were rising after Iraq had invaded Kuwait. The USA was ready to intervene and war was on the cards, and as we know, for some reason, this is always ripe for wrestling stories. And that's exactly what happened at WrestleMania 7 when Hulk Hogan clashed with the now Iraqi sympathizer Sergeant Slaughter. The idea, as anyone can see, was to have the traitor, who was now the world champion, lose his title to the Immortal One as patriotism rained down from the rafters. The fans would then celebrate in this triumph, but it was just too eerie to work. Even Bret Hart would go on to say that a lot of the locker room were also uncomfortable using the ongoing conflict, complete with a body count, to further a narrative. It didn't work as fans and critics alike found this way too close to the bone, and as soon as WrestleMania was out the way, WWE quietly swept it under the rug. Until they would use similar tactics down the line. Number 1, Chris Jericho vs Triple H. I don't know who Chris Jericho upset in the lead up to his clash with Triple H at WrestleMania 18, the way WWE used him was just odd. Despite being the first ever undisputed champ, a nod that was absolutely the right call, the main event of the biggest event in 2002 started to feel more like Triple H versus Stephanie McMahon. Their domestic quarrel took center stage, and Y2J was kinda just over to the side. Instead of coming across like a threat to the game, Jericho had to run errands for Stephanie on the Raws leading up to the match, and actually once walked her dog. How that was meant to tie into a good build, I don't know. That dog featured a lot too, because on the go-home Raw, Triple H asked for custody of said mutt, only for it to get run over by a limo. This was really weird. The two were also hindered by the fact they had to go on after The Rock vs Hulk Hogan, which had taken the crowd and left them dead, and nobody could have survived in that spot. It was impossible. That was understandable, but everything before it, I don't know, it just didn't do too much to light up anybody's world.